50 investors, $3.2 million, and a senior pastor who allegedly used the trust of his own congregation as the delivery mechanism for a multi-year fraud scheme. Richard Reynaldo Garcia stood in the pulpit of Gracia Church in Fort Worth, Texas, every week, and according to federal prosecutors, he was simultaneously running a financial con that targeted the very people sitting in his pews, along with their families and friends. This isn't a story about a pastor who fell into sin. This is a story about an indicted man who, according to the FBI, built an entire architecture of shell entities, false promises, and fabricated documents, and used the language of faith to close the deal. Garcia, 53, is the senior pastor of Gracia Church. On June 23, the FBI announced charges against him for allegedly defrauding more than 50 investors out of $3.2 million. The schemes ran from 2021 to 2026, and the victims weren't random strangers. They were church members and the people closest to them. A federal grand jury indicted Garcia on 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, 1 count of aggravated identity theft, and 2 counts of wire fraud. U.S. Attorney Ryan Raybould didn't mince words in a statement covered by NBC TV Channel 5 in Fort Worth. He said Garcia allegedly took advantage of his victims' faith by promising significant profits through investment opportunities, and instead used their funds to selfishly enrich himself at their expense. That's not commentary from a media outlet. That's the United States Attorney's Office describing the alleged operating model of a sitting pastor. Here's where it gets systematic. Garcia allegedly didn't run this scheme under one name. He ran it under several: Ministerio Gracia, Iglesia Gracia de Texas, Gracia Church of Texas, A Pesar de Todo LLC, and MG Kingdom Inc. Multiple ministry names, multiple entities, and, according to the indictment, an unnamed accomplice the court documents simply call co-conspirator A. The indictment states plainly, Defendant Garcia and co-conspirator A would induce others to enter into contracts through false pretenses, promising significant returns. Multiple entity names are not automatically evidence of wrongdoing in ministry. Plenty of legitimate church networks operate under several corporate umbrellas. But when those names are allegedly deployed specifically to move investor funds through different channels, while promising returns that were never coming, the structure stops looking like ministry administration and starts looking like a financial shell game. The first alleged scheme should sound familiar to anyone who's watched real estate fraud unfold. Investors were told their money would renovate church buildings, which would then be resold at a profit. Classic flip model, except, according to the indictment, the renovations largely never happened. One investor handed over $50,000 to renovate a church in Arlington, Texas. Garcia allegedly told that investor the project generated a 55% profit, which he said he was rolling into a new project. The indictment states plainly, that wasn't true. Another investor sent $125,000 for a renovation in Texarkana. A third sent $168,000 for a project in Lubbock. In both cases, the indictment says, no renovation ever took place. Instead, prosecutors allege the money went toward business operating costs, unrelated business expenses, and their own personal expenses. Not toward the church's investors thought they were funding, toward Garcia and his co-conspirator directly. The second alleged scheme moved from real estate into event promotion. Garcia and his co-conspirator allegedly pitched joint ventures to stage Christian concerts overseas, promising investors a share of ticket revenue. According to a criminal complaint filed April 9th by the investigating FBI agent, only one concert out of the pitched projects actually happened. And even then, investors were never paid back. One investor gave $40,000 for a concert in the Dominican Republic. No return, according to the complaint. Another gave $100,000 specifically to secure a stadium venue in Colombia. That concert never happened. That money was never returned. The indictment alleges the same pattern repeats here as with the church renovations. Funds intended for a specific venture were instead redirected toward operating expenses, unrelated business costs, and personal spending. This is the part that should concern anyone thinking about church financial oversight broadly. The indictment alleges Garcia directed some investors to funnel their money into the church, not as an investment, but as a donation, disguising, in the indictment's words, funds intended to fund a business venture, and to earn a profit as funds intended as a charitable donation. Investigators say some investors believe those donations were also being used to inflate the church's revenue figures, potentially to help secure future loans. If that's accurate, it means the alleged fraud wasn't just extracting money from individuals. It was allegedly using that money to manufacture financial credibility for the institution itself, which could then be leveraged for additional financing. That's not a single bad decision. That's a structure. The Kenya trips. Garcia also allegedly sold church-related trips to Kenya at $2,000 per person. According to the indictment, those trips were either canceled outright or never booked in the first place. Mission trips and cross-continental church partnerships are built entirely on trust. Trust that the money sent ahead of time will actually produce the trip, the ministry work, the partnership it was promised for. When that trust is allegedly weaponized for a domestic fraud scheme, the damage isn't contained to Fort Worth. It reaches into every community that Tripp was supposedly going to touch. The indictment also describes what prosecutors call lulling payments. Small payments made back to investors periodically, not to make them whole, but to ease their concerns and keep them from asking too many questions. It's a recognized pattern in fraud cases, just enough money flowing back to keep the story alive. And then there's the identity theft charge. According to the indictment, Garcia used someone else's name and address to create false documentation filed with the Texas Secretary of State. That's not incidental. That's alleged fabrication of official state records to support the broader scheme. What is affinity fraud? There's a name for what prosecutors say happened here. The Securities and Exchange Commission classifies this type of alleged crime as affinity fraud. Schemes where the perpetrator specifically targets a community they claim to belong to. The Ohio Department of Commerce has published guidance on exactly this pattern. Their warning is blunt. These scams work because they exploit the trust and closeness that already exists inside a shared community. And victims of affinity fraud are often reluctant to go to the authorities at all. They'd rather try to resolve things quietly, inside the group, than expose the person who deceived them. That's precisely why affinity fraud is so effective inside churches. The fraud doesn't have to work hard to earn trust. The trust is already built in. It comes with the relationship, the shared faith, the shared community. The fraud simply has to exploit it. The Ohio Department of Commerce lays out 6 warning signs to watch for. Be cautious of any investment that's marketed as closely tied to religious belief. Watch for a promoter who leans heavily on their connection to a religious leader to sell the opportunity. Be wary when a new, unfamiliar member suddenly shows up promoting a can't-miss investment. Don't accept the claim that religious-based investments are exempt from regulation. They aren't. Do your own homework on both the promoter and the investment itself before committing money. If something feels off, report it. Don't let the person avoid law enforcement scrutiny just because the matter stays within the family. If any of that sounds familiar after everything we just walked through, the multiple ministry names, the promised returns, the donations disguised as investments, that's not a coincidence. That's the playbook. An FBI agent arrested Garcia on May 2nd at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. The grand jury handed down its indictment on June 2nd, and Garcia entered a not guilty plea on June 9th. His trial is currently set for October 13th. The Roy's report reached out to Garcia's attorneys, William Biggs and Matthew Smid, for comment. As of publication, they had not responded. If convicted, each wire fraud count carries a potential sentence of up to 20 years in prison. The aggravated identity theft charge carries an additional 2-year sentence. To be clear, these are allegations. Garcia has pleaded not guilty, and he is entitled to that presumption of innocence through trial. But the indictment itself lays out a specific, methodical pattern. Multiple entities, multiple schemes, multiple continents, and, allegedly, one consistent destination for the money. Richard Garcia himself. 50-plus investors. $3.2 million. Church renovations that never happened. Concerts that never happened. Mission trips to Kenya that never happened. If the government's case holds up in October, this will stand as one of the more brazen alleged financial exploitations of church trust we've covered on this channel. Not because of the dollar figure alone, but because of how deliberately the architecture of faith itself was allegedly used as the sales mechanism. We'll be tracking this case through trial. Stay with us.